The heavy wooden doors of Westminster have always held secrets, but few could have predicted the chilling silence that would follow one of the most politically sensitive discussions in modern royal history. It began as an unlisted, deeply confidential parliamentary session, a gathering that was never meant to find its way into the public light, yet by the time the morning mist cleared over the River Thames, whispers had already begun to escape the guarded corridors of power. These were not the usual political rumors that dissipate with the changing headlines, but rather a sharp, definitive shift in the constitutional landscape that threatened to completely dismantle the remaining royal privileges ever granted to Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex. Inside the committee rooms, staffers reportedly packed away their documents in absolute silence, refusing to meet each other's eyes, while across the city at Buckingham Palace, senior aides exchanged nervous glances behind carefully maintained smiles. The atmosphere was thick with an undeniable sense of inevitability, as if a clock had been ticking in the background for years, and the final hour had suddenly arrived without warning. What materialized from behind those closed doors was a sealed motion, a precise and legally calculated document tied directly to every honorary title, symbolic role, and traditional association that had survived the initial Sussex departure. Insiders claimed that the crown had already been quietly warned before the gavel even fell, suggesting that the machinery of state was moving with a terrifying independence, stepping into territory that the royal family had desperately tried to keep within the private confines of their own bloodline. For years, the palace had operated on a strategy of controlled silence, treating every public rupture, every explosive interview, and every wave of media anger like a temporary storm that would eventually run out of oxygen if left ignored. But this moment was fundamentally different because it did not originate from a television studio or a tabloid headline. It was born within the sovereign chambers of British law, where sentimentality holds no power and institutional continuity is the only currency that matters. The question before the lawmakers was brutally practical, examining whether these remaining honorary associations could logically continue to exist when the individual holding them had grown so distant, so controversial, and so profoundly separated from the daily sacrifices of the working monarchy. As the hours dragged on toward midnight, the language used within the walls of Westminster reportedly hardened from a cautious review into something far sharper, colder, and infinitely more dangerous for the future of the Sussex legacy. What had started as a technical exploration of royal protocols rapidly transformed into a demand for total and absolute separation, a constitutional severing designed to ensure that the authority of the crown could never again be used outside the discipline of the palace walls. When senior royal aides were finally informed of the internal consensus, a wave of quiet panic rippled through the palace machinery, not because they disagreed with the sentiment, but because the political world had moved before the monarch had spoken. In the delicate balance of the British Constitution, when Parliament initiates a change regarding royal status before Buckingham Palace issues a formal statement, it signifies that the issue has escaped the boundaries of a private family dispute and entered the unpredictable arena of state authority. Prince William was reportedly briefed on the developments under a veil of strict privacy, not as a brother-in-law dealing with the lingering wounds of a fractured family, but as the future king who would one day inherit the long-term consequences of every unresolved ambiguity. The phrase complete royal separation began to echo through secure communication channels like a distant warning bell, carrying with it the undeniable reality that these lingering titles were no longer viewed as harmless symbolic ornaments, but as active liabilities attached to the reputation of the monarchy itself. When the first murmurs of this parliamentary movement began to reach media insiders, many dismissed it as mere exaggeration, another dramatic narrative designed to feed the public's endless appetite for royal conflict. However, that skepticism vanished the moment confirmation arrived that a sealed document had indeed been presented, specifying the exact mechanisms by which traditional protections could be legally reassessed. Suddenly, the long-standing silence from the palace lost its appearance of calm indifference. It began to feel strategic, deliberate, and deeply protective, resembling a heavy door being locked from the inside while the rest of the world stood on the steps trying to understand who had turned the key. The true gravity of this moment lay not just in the potential removal of titles, but in the profound cultural shift it represented, signaling that the old boundaries governing royal immunity had permanently shifted. The monarchy was no longer merely defending its borders through traditional etiquette and dignified distance. It was allowing the formal structures of the state to openly question whether royal status could survive when detached from institutional trust and mutual loyalty. Behind the carefully worded briefings and the nervous restraint of palace spokespeople, a devastating truth was beginning to take shape with undeniable force, proving that the internal fractures which had been hidden behind staged appearances and diplomatic smiles had finally exhausted the patience of the state. According to those familiar with the deeper circles of power, private councils within Buckingham Palace had already begun referring to this ongoing tension as a crisis of constitutional fatigue, a weariness born from years of managing a reputational wound that refused to heal. Every accusation, every memoir, and every public grievance had been met by the palace with a disciplined adherence to tradition, but beneath that calm exterior, a profound anxiety had been growing among the senior members of the family. They feared that the institution was no longer dealing with a temporary disagreement between relatives, but with a permanent, open-ended vulnerability that could be weaponized at any moment, threatening the very foundations of predictability and dignity upon which the crown relies. The palace staff had been the first to feel the crushing weight of this tension, tasked with the impossible job of writing statements that said almost nothing while trying to manage global headlines that meant everything. Insiders noted that the fundamental contradiction of the situation had become entirely unbearable to the palace logic, as it allowed an individual to retain the immense symbolic power and global recognition of the crown while remaining completely exempt from the strict behavior and public accountability expected of those who serve it. Prince William and Princess Anne reportedly arrived at this exact conclusion from two entirely different perspectives, with William looking toward the security of his future reign and focusing on the preservation of the discipline that Queen Elizabeth II had spent 7 decades enforcing. To William, every unresolved privilege and every lingering exception represented a potential crisis, waiting to disrupt the monarchy he would one day lead, while to Anne, any compromise on the principle of duty was a direct threat to the core identity of the royal house. Their shared concern was not born out of personal anger or a desire for retaliation, but from a cold, institutional calculation that the crown simply cannot survive if royal status becomes a commodity that can be enjoyed without the lifelong burden of royal service. King Charles found himself at the exhausted center of this escalating storm, forced to maintain the public image of a benevolent and unifying father while privately enduring the immense weight of a sovereign's responsibility. Every choice available to the monarch carried a devastating cost, where moving too quickly would make the palace look vindicated and harsh, while delaying further risked making the crown look weak and incapable of protecting its own borders. As Parliament began to pull at the threads of old agreements, the silence surrounding the king grew heavier, serving as a reminder that in the grand theater of history, the survival of the institution will always demand the sacrifice of personal peace. As the constitutional gears in Westminster continued to turn with a cold, mechanical precision, the focus of the crisis naturally shifted toward the structural foundations of the monarchy itself, dragging old compromises back into the harsh fluorescent light of contemporary political scrutiny. In the inner sanctums of Buckingham Palace, senior officials were forced to confront a reality they had spent years trying to avoid, realizing that the temporary structures built to contain the fallout of the initial Sussex departure were beginning to completely give way under the weight of sustained global scrutiny. For nearly half a decade, the public had been led to believe that the arrangements negotiated during the historic Sandringham summit had established a permanent peace, a balanced framework that allowed Prince Harry and Meghan Markle to pursue private freedom in America while preserving the dignity and boundaries of the working monarchy in the United Kingdom. However, behind closed doors, constitutional experts and parliamentary advisors were discovering that this celebrated compromise had actually left behind massive legal gray areas, ambiguous loopholes that had quietly transformed from minor administrative oversights into existential threats to the crown's authority. The central issue that paralyzed the private councils of the estate was no longer a matter of personal emotion or fractured brotherly bonds. It was a clinical, unyielding debate over the very definition of royal representation in a modern, hyper-connected world. Lawmakers in Parliament reportedly began examining the dangerous precedent of allowing individuals to carry the prestige, branding, and symbolic weight of the British crown into commercial spaces without being subject to the continuous discipline, vetting, and public service requirements that govern the rest of the family. This contradiction had slowly eroded the patience of the political establishment, transforming what was once handled as a delicate family estrangement into a matter of national interest that required direct legislative clarity. Inside the palace, an atmosphere of icy determination began to replace the exhausted hesitation that had characterized the early years of the reign, driven primarily by an accelerated review of all remaining royal patronages and honorary titles still associated with the Duchess of Sussex. Sources close to the royal household revealed that Princess Anne had emerged as a central figure in this structural reorganization, operating not out of personal animosity, but out of a rigid adherence to the institutional principles that define the entire life of her late mother, Queen Elizabeth II. Known among the palace staff as the monarchy's most relentless enforcer of duty, and reportedly viewed the ongoing ambiguity not as a series of unfortunate misunderstandings, but as an active, continuous erosion of the crown's sacred pact with the British public. She held several highly confidential meetings with senior constitutional lawyers to ensure that if Parliament moved forward with its legislative restructuring, the palace would not be caught off guard or appear reactive to the whims of the political class. Her philosophy was chillingly simple and historically proven. The crown can survive scandal, it can survive tragedy, and it can even survive public anger, but it cannot survive the breakdown of internal discipline, because once royal status is detached from active royal duty, the entire moral architecture of the monarchy collapses. Prince William reportedly shared this unyielding perspective, reinforcing his aunt's efforts from behind the scenes with a focused intensity that surprised many within the older generation of courtiers. For William, the stakes could not possibly be higher, as he was not merely looking at the immediate headlines of the week, but was actively projecting the stability of the institution 20 to 30 years into the future, when the responsibility of the crown would rest entirely upon his own shoulders. He understood with absolute clarity that every exception made today, every blurred boundary left unresolved for the sake of avoiding a temporary media storm, would inevitably manifest as a full-blown constitutional crisis during his own future reign. The future king was described as being entirely unwilling to inherit a weakened, compromised crown that had been fractured by years of sentimental hesitation and incomplete separations. Together, Princess Anne and Prince William formed an unbreakable institutional front, quietly implementing what insiders referred to as the Iron Continuity Protocol, a systematic review of every lingering connection, title, and symbolic association to ensure they either directly protected the crown or were immediately severed from its structure. This internal pressure placed King Charles in a position of unimaginable emotional isolation, forcing him to inhabit the agonizing space where the instincts of a loving father collided directly with the solemn oaths of a reigning sovereign. Privately, the king was said to be profoundly exhausted by the endless balancing act, carrying the constant burden of knowing that any move toward institutional firmness would be interpreted by the global media as a cruel rejection of his own son and daughter-in-law, while any further delay would be viewed by the British public and Parliament as a dangerous sign of structural weakness. The weight of this dilemma grew even heavier as older controversies, explosive interviews, and the lingering echoes of the Sussex memoir were pulled back into the parliamentary debate, no longer viewed merely as emotional family fallout, but analyzed through the cold lens of constitutional law. Lawmakers were no longer asking whether the family had been hurt by the public criticisms. They were actively investigating whether the legal privileges of the monarchy could safely survive when tied to individuals who operated entirely outside the control of the palace machine. The debate inside the halls of Westminster had reached a point of no return, where the old language of diplomatic compromise was replaced by a sharp, legalistic demand for total institutional clarity. Palace aides who had spent years carefully crafting neutral statements found themselves absorbing immense pressure, Realizing that the era of waiting for time to heal the wounds had definitively ended, replaced by an atmosphere of decisive action where sentimentality was treated as a dangerous luxury the monarchy could no longer afford. Every remaining honorary link, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, was subjected to a brutal, single question: does this association strengthen the security of the crown, or does it expose it to further unpredictable vulnerability? As the quiet machinery of the state tightened its grip around the remaining threads of the Sandringham Agreement, it became blindingly obvious to all involved that the Sussex departure had never truly ended. It had merely entered a far more clinical and final phase where the romanticism of family ties was completely stripped away to preserve the survival of the state. When the final echo of the parliamentary vote finally settled over the halls of Westminster, the immediate aftermath brought a chilling, historical clarity that completely shattered any remaining illusions of a quiet family reconciliation. According to those present within the legislative chambers, the silence that followed the announcement of the vote was heavier than any public statement, a profound stillness that forced even veteran political commentators to acknowledge that a permanent line in the sand had been drawn. This was not a minor administrative reprimand or a symbolic gesture designed to appease the public. It represented the most definitive, legally backed distancing of a prominent royal figure from the House of Windsor in the modern era. The political machinery of the state had officially moved to strip away the remaining honorary associations and institutional links that had once anchored Meghan Markle to the traditional protections of the crown. For those who believed the monarchy had been dangerously passive for years, the decision was viewed as a long-overdue act of self-defense, a hard-nosed correction that restored the fundamental principle that royal status cannot exist without public responsibility. Conversely, for those who viewed the Duchess of Sussex as an outsider unfairly targeted by an archaic establishment, the move felt like a clinical, politically motivated exclusion wrapped in the sophisticated language of constitutional protocol. Regardless of personal interpretation, the operational reality inside Buckingham Palace was entirely unyielding, as senior officials immediately turned their attention toward managing the global geopolitical fallout of a decision that could no longer be contained within the shadows. Within minutes of the internal leaks reaching global news networks, the public landscape erupted into an intense debate over the unprecedented nature of the intervention, questioning whether a democratic parliament should hold the ultimate authority to redefine connections originally granted under the sovereign power of the monarchy. Royal correspondents quickly pointed out that what made this development so historically volatile was the fact that the pressure had originated from the political world just as much as it had from the royal family itself, elevating a private family estrangement into a high-stakes drama about national identity and the meaning of public duty. Inside the palace administration, the focus rapidly widened to confront the deep, cascading implications this final severing would have on Prince Harry, who now found himself completely isolated between the life he had chosen in America and the ancient institution whose blood still defined his existence. Insiders whispered that the total removal of his wife's remaining royal associations effectively functioned as a locked gate, signaling to the world that the palace was no longer constructing its long-term strategy around the sentimental hope of an emotional family repair. The old compromise of allowing the Sussexes to exist in a privileged middle space, enjoying global royal branding while remaining exempt from the daily discipline and sacrifices of the working monarchy, had been permanently dismantled by the machinery of the state. For Prince Harry, this was a devastating psychological and institutional realization, as the final, fragile threads tying his new commercial reality to the historic legacy of his birthright were cleanly cut away in a matter of hours. The palace mood, however, had undergone a fundamental transformation, while a deep, underlying sorrow remained for the personal loss of a son and brother. The institutional fear that had once dictated their cautious public responses completely vanished from the room. The monarchy had spent years absorbing public criticisms and adjusting its schedules around the unpredictable timing of external media attacks, but under the quiet guidance of Princess Anne and Prince William, the institution had finally learned how to survive without letting its future be held hostage by the threat of further retaliation. Prince William maintained a disciplined, unyielding emotional distance throughout the finalization of the protocols, refusing to treat the corporate restructuring of the crown as a personal family wound, choosing instead to focus entirely on the heavy inheritance that would one day rest upon his own shoulders. He stood alongside his aunt as a symbol of an uncompromising new era, a smaller, colder, but infinitely more secure monarchy built strictly around the concept of proven service rather than inherited celebrity. Even King Charles, who had suffered the immense private agony of balancing a father's love with a sovereign's duty, reportedly accepted the hard reality that public clarity was the only path forward if the crown was to preserve its legitimacy in an age of relentless public scrutiny. The new operational framework, quietly referred to by palace aides as the era of controlled access, was designed to ensure that no individual outside the working structure could ever again draw power or commercial leverage from a symbolic association with the crown. As the House of Windsor settled into the heavy silence of this final chapter, the underlying message to the world became impossible to ignore. The survival of the institution will always demand that personal desires bend before the collective weight of the crown. The ultimate legacy of this crisis was not defined by anger or revenge, but by a cold, generational declaration that within the British monarchy, privilege and responsibility are permanently locked in an unbreakable, sacred bond. Long after the immediate headlines fade into history and the public debate moves on to other scandals, the palace will remember this moment as the turning point where the crown chose absolute discipline over sentimental compromise, permanently rewriting the boundaries of royal identity to ensure that the ancient institution survives the chaotic demands of the modern world.